Okay, so the term metabolism, it includes a number of chemical reactions. It's the total number of chemical reactions that take place in an organism. The totality of an organism's chemical reactions. So here's a diagram that basically summarizes this. If you start with one molecule, let's say we call it A, and this molecule is going to eventually give you a product that we're calling D. Well, to get to A from D, sometimes there are many reactions that have to take place to transform this molecule A into the molecule D that we need. And in the process, we create intermediary molecules called B and C, and every time it's a chemical reaction and another chemical reaction and another chemical reaction. And each one of these chemical reactions requires, most of the time, an enzyme. And enzymes are proteins. We've seen that in previous chapters. Enzymes are made out of proteins. It's a protein. And the function of an enzyme is to catalyze a chemical reaction, meaning to make it go faster. And we're going to talk a little bit about that today. So the totality of all of these reactions is called metabolism. So this is called a metabolic pathway. And actually, if you ever take microbiology, you learn that there are these specific metabolic pathways in bacteria where certain antibiotics, what they do is they prevent a specific enzyme to work. So let's say enzyme 2, and this antibiotic preventing the enzyme 2 from working, it basically disrupts the metabolic pathway, and the bacteria can't survive if it can't produce product D. So this is one way of killing bacteria and how antibiotics work. They act on certain metabolic pathways. All right, so within that umbrella of metabolism, there are several pathways. There are several types of chemical reactions. The catabolic pathways, and then we'll see the anabolic pathways. So the ones that release energy by breaking down the bonds between the molecules, within the molecules, between the atoms, and creating basically either smaller molecules or separating atoms from each other, those are called catabolic reactions because they are going to release the energy that was stored in the bond. So we're going to see in an upcoming chapter, not here, but we're going to see the process of cellular respiration. And that's exactly what happens during cellular respiration, where you start with glucose, and the glucose is a 6-carbon molecule. And this 6-carbon molecule is going to turn into a 3-carbon molecule. And this 3-carbon molecule, well, it's a shorter molecule. So by splitting the 6-carbon molecule into 2 3-carbon molecules, you release the energy from there. All right, so the 6-carbon molecule turns into 2 3-carbon molecules, and just breaking apart this 6-carbon molecule into those 2 smaller ones, that releases energy just from breaking that bond between the two. Okay, so the chemical reaction that's described here, it's not something you have to like immediately worry about, but it's coming up in an upcoming chapter, so this is something you will have to kind of understand when we get to that. Okay, so you see that when glucose is broken down, it releases this energy. That's the energy that it's releasing. And there's energy that's released right here. And this is energy that's going to be useful for the cell, but that's one of the purposes of breaking down glucose. And glucose is a carbohydrate. It's a type of sugar, and it's a source of energy for us. The other type of pathway is called the anabolic pathway, or we have many anabolic pathways. And this is in the opposite direction. We consume energy to build molecules. So we use that ATP because ATP is a source of energy. We'll get into the details of ATP in a little bit as well. ATP is basically the energy currency and for the cell. So when ATP is released, it's energy the cell can use. And then when the cell uses it to create a large molecule, that would be called an anabolic pathway because it used the energy and it created a larger molecule. So here the example is in a plant cell, which is something that we can't do. That specific example is in plants. I mean, there are other examples of anabolic pathways in the body, but this particular example is in plants. Plants take these very small molecules of carbon dioxide. That's a gas, the gas that's in the air. Carbon dioxide is just one carbon molecule, and it uses 6 of these one carbon molecules to create a 6 carbon molecule, which is glucose. You see? So we're taking small molecules and assembling click, 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 like that, like Lego pieces, and creating a large molecule. That requires energy that's going to be basically buried into these covalent bonds. And this glucose, when it is broken down by the organisms that eat it up, is going to release the energy back out. You see how that works? The energy is taken in and harvested and buried into the molecule. And then when the molecule is chopped up into smaller pieces, the energy is released again. And that's why we eat, because this food is a source of energy for us, for our cells. And glucose happens to be the molecule that is the most used by our brain cells, our neurons. Okay. So the capacity to cause change, especially to do work, is what energy does for us. With energy, we can do things. We can move. We can create something. So let's see here. What type of work do the cells do? So it can be chemical work, mechanical work, or movement, transport. So the types of energy, let's talk about these different types of energy. Kinetic energy and potential energy. So let's try to understand what's the difference. So when we talk about kinetic energy, we're talking about energy that's associated with some kind of movement. That's what kinetic is referring to. So it's energy associated with movement of objects, the motion of objects. So when something moves, it's called kinetic energy. And thermal energy, so that's heat. Kinetic energy is associated with the random movement of atoms and or molecules, and that releases heat. So when molecules move, boom, 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 and they move from one place to another, and which they do in the cell, when molecules move, they release kinetic energy because that movement requires energy to be used. So energy is going to be used for the movement to occur. That's how we should formulate that. Potential energy, on the other hand, is the energy that's kind of like stored and inside something. Energy that so the definition here, energy that matter possesses because of its location or structure. So, for example, the example of a large molecule of carbons all linked together, every one of these bonds is holding energy in it. And that's what we call potential energy. It's energy that is potentially there, but we don't need it yet. But if we do need it, we would have to break this bond. And when we break this bond, the energy is released. So that's what we call potential energy. And also, wherever you're located as an entire organism, that's also a source of energy. For example, the example actually that I want to illustrate with a picture is on the next slide. So this is chemical energy. Chemical energy is potential energy available for release in a chemical reaction. So that's what I drew here on the side. And here, thermal energy is a form of kinetic energy, and that's associated with the random movement of atoms or molecules. All right, so let's talk about these energies by using one example, the example of a diver sitting at the edge of a dock and diving into the water of this really beautiful big lake, and then climbing back up and so forth and so on. So a diver standing on a diving board has actually a lot of energy in him. So it has more potential energy on the platform than it has when it's in the water. That's because this energy is going to change from just not being used at all as he's standing, he's not moving, to once he jumps and now he's falling into the water, that becomes kinetic energy. And then he's going to swim in the water. That's definitely more kinetic energy. And, when you swim, you feel you're making an effort, right? So you're using up energy. So the diving process converts potential energy that this diver has to kinetic energy. So a diver has less potential energy once it's in the water than on the platform. Climbing up converts the kinetic energy of muscle movement to potential energy back into the body. So there are certain laws of thermodynamics. So all of these movements and energy, it falls into this umbrella called thermodynamics in physics. And thermodynamics specifically, it's the study of energy transformations that occur in a collection of matter. So I'm going to try to keep it as simple as possible. Just for terminology purposes, when we use the term system, we're talking about the matter under study. So if the system is a fish in the water, that's the system. If the system is a human being on a diving board, that's the system. So it's just whatever matter that we're studying. The surroundings is everything outside of the system. So, if that human being is on top of a diving board versus down in the water, right? Whatever the system around that human being is its surroundings. So an isolated system is unable to exchange either energy or matter with its surroundings. An isolated system. So a human being that cannot interact with its surroundings will not be able to exchange or energy or matter with its environment. It really has to be an open system to be able to see a change or transfer of energy and matter with the surroundings. So the first law of thermodynamics, because this is physics and there are certain things that they've been determined to be the case, a law, we call them laws. The first law of thermodynamics is energy can be transferred and even transformed, like from one type of energy to another type of energy, but it cannot be created or destroyed and disappear. So you can't create it from out of thin air, and you can't really kind of make it go away and never seen again. It basically goes from one form to another form. So this is called the principle of conservation of energy. The energy in the universe is constant. So let me give you an example so it's not so vague and and you start panicking because we're getting into physics. No, no, no. We're just really going to keep it related to biology. Look at this chemical energy in the fish, right? The fish has flesh, and this flesh is made of cells, and cells are made of molecules, right? We learned that in the first chapters of this course. So this flesh is going to be eaten by the organism eating the fish. And when you eat food, your digestive system breaks it down to get the energy out of it for your own cells. So this chemical energy that's in the fish right here, right? This chemical energy that's in the fish is being consumed by the bear, and it's going to go down its digestive system, and oops, I lost my screen. There we go. And then, the molecules are going to be broken down, and that energy is going to be released, and it's going to be used by the cells in the bear. So the energy is going to get transformed from chemical energy to potential energy that maybe will be kind of in the form of the bear built up molecules to form, bigger muscle mass. Right? So we need proteins to make muscle, and if we're increasing muscle mass, we need more proteins. To build those proteins, we need to assemble the monomers, which are called amino acids. To assemble these monomers together, to string them along, we need energy to do that. So that's the principle of conservation of energy. That energy doesn't appear from nowhere. You don't just think about it and you have energy in your body. It comes from somewhere and it goes into somewhere specific. So that energy now is in you, and then that energy is going to be used up when you're doing movement. Right? When your muscles start contracting, that energy is going to be used up, and that. Like here, like he's moving to catch the fish, to eat the fish. These are movements. So there's constant energy being used, broken down. Well, the source is broken down, the energy is released, and then the energy is being used up by the organism that just ingested it, etc. So it's constant exchange of energy. The second law of thermodynamics: every energy transfer or transformation increases the entropy of the universe. Oh, what's the entropy? The entropy is the measure of disorder or randomness. It's like the universe works towards this, towards entropy. That's the second law of thermodynamics. Energy transfer increases entropy of the universe. So there's always a goal to go towards more randomness. So if a given process leads to an increase in entropy, then that process can proceed without an input in energy. And that's a spontaneous process. Okay. So here, the bear is using its energy that it just acquired from all that fish he ate. Now that's all this energy from the fish's molecules, now it's released and given to the cells for example, muscle cells to actually contract and create a movement of this bear running into this water. So when the muscles contract, what happens is, yes, of course, there will be movement. So that will be kinetic energy. You see how chemical energy gets transformed into kinetic energy, but also thermal energy, because that movement created heat dissipation as well. Just like the energy you use in your car, when you break it down, right? You use up the gas in your car. Yes, it moves the wheels, great. The motor's running and the car's moving forward, but there's also heat loss in the engine, in the tires, and that's another form of energy. So it's not 100% of the energy doesn't go to kinetics. 100% of that potential energy is used to other types of energies. right? 100% is changed into something else. But into what? And that's basically, it distributes itself. Most of it is for movement, some of it is for heat dissipation. And heat and gases that are exhaled and water that evaporates, all this is kind of randomness. That's the increase in disorder, right? You have the molecules that are being exhaled and water that's being perspired and heat that's radiating off the body. Right. So let's talk now about more of the nitty-gritty of this kind of, how we look at energy. So when you see energy, how much is actually available? And that's what we call free energy. It's the portion of a system's energy that can perform work when temperature and pressure are uniform. So always temperature and pressure are going to be factors into how this energy is going to be used up. So this free energy that we call delta G, it's basically the energy at the end of a state. And the energy, and take away that, the energy that was used to be at the beginning of that state. And if the difference is positive, then we have energy to do work. So if you know delta G for a process, you can predict whether that process will be spontaneous, it will happen towards randomness, or not. So a negative delta G will actually produce a spontaneous reaction. A negative delta G will produce a spontaneous chemical reaction. Why? Because if we have more energy in the beginning, and after, whatever that transformation happens, we have less energy in the end, that means there was a negative difference, right? Less energy in the beginning, more energy, less energy at the end, more energy in the beginning. So we end up with a negative delta G here that when you see it right away, you see, okay, so that means we have energy left and we can have a spontaneous reaction. When delta G is positive, it's not going to be a spontaneous reaction. Okay. So let's look at this diver. And when he's on the diving board, he has a lot of free energy. And he has a lot of work capacity, because when you have a lot of energy, that means you're going to be able to do a lot of work. And he also has gravity that's going to be counted towards that. In a spontaneous change, the free energy of the system is going to decrease because it's going to be used up. The system becomes more stable, and the released free energy can be harnessed to actually do the work. So at the end, we have less free energy because we just used it up to do that work of, here it's plunging. The organism is, more stable, but there's less work capacity by then because we kind of used it up, right, to get to that state. So process is going to be spontaneous and perform work only when it's moving towards equilibrium. So the metabolic pathways of a cell, they never reach equilibrium. So we're always basically moving towards equilibrium, but never really, really reaching it. So here there are two examples. So the first example of the diver is this gravitational motion. This is really what's making the transformation from one stage to the next stage. So from being still at the diving board, to, diving into the water. So another example of movement towards equilibrium is the diffusion of molecules. So these are molecules that are, very concentrated where they are, and this environment around them is void of this molecule, right? If you look at, like here, there's none of these purple molecule out there. It's just in the center here. So these purple molecules will have a tendency to move to areas where there are less concentrated, areas where they're less concentrated, because the equilibrium is we need everywhere to be equal. So if it's very concentrated somewhere, we need to move some of those particles towards the area where it's less concentrated so we can have more evenness. All right. So gravitational motion is an example. Diffusion is another example. And chemical reactions is another example. If you break a molecule into smaller particles, that actually kind of like creates this lack of order, right? Because now they're like not together and strung together in a specific structure. They're kind of now like going into separating. So free energy and metabolism. Let's talk about that. So chemical reactions can be exergonic. So what that means, and those are important definitions, what that means is that they're going to be a net release of free energy. Release. This is going to be a release. A release. A release of free energy. So an exergonic reaction is going to be a reaction where the delta G is negative. The reaction is going to be spontaneous because the delta G is negative, and there will be a release of energy. So the diagram is very straightforward. Here are the molecules in the beginning. We call them reactants. So if you've never seen this term, make sure you learn it. The reactants. And these reactants turn into products. But on the way of becoming products, they will release energy. So the amount of energy released is delta negative. Why? Because the energy at the end, this energy at the end, is lower than the energy at the beginning. Remember, this is what I said earlier in this slide here. The energy at the end, right? G is for the energy at the end, and G here is for the energy in the beginning. So if the energy at the end is bigger, is smaller, then you're going to have a delta G that's going to be negative, right? If this is smaller than this. If the final state is smaller than the initial state, you're going to have a delta G that's negative. Okay. Now we do have chemical reactions in the body that are endergonic. Endergonic. That means they absorb free energy from the surroundings. And at that point, the G at the end is bigger than the G at the beginning. So the G at the end being bigger, you're going to have, with the chemical reaction, delta G is delta G. I forgot what was the writing terminal, delta G at the end, take away delta G at the beginning, right? You see when the delta G at the end, sorry, the G, not the delta G. Sorry about that. Okay. When the G at the end is bigger than the G at the beginning, then that difference is going to be positive. So, yeah, so that would be the case for endergonic reactions. So in the cells, in our cells, we have this constantly, and we have both constantly. We use ergonic reactions to drive endergonic reactions. And this is just how it works. We have substrates that need to become products, and we have enzymes that help us take one to the other. But sometimes we need a little push with some energy, and sometimes we don't. So here we can see an endergonic reaction at the top, where the energy from ATP is going to be used up. It's going to be used up, go into the substrate, and then you end up with a substrate, a product that is that acquired energy into its structure. And that's why we call this an endergonic reaction. And then the opposite is true as well. If we have an ADP that goes and gets buried in this process, ADP turns into ATP. So basically, it acquired a phosphate, adenosine diphosphate, turns into adenosine triphosphate. So this adenosine triphosphate has 3 phosphate group. And even without talking about the other molecules, which are also important, here, just talking about this phosphorus here. Now you broke a phosphorus down to create a triphosphate molecule. So actually, this is what happened over from here to here. We lost a chemical bond, which released the energy, which was then used by substrate A to produce product A. You see how that works? So adenosine triphosphate has 3 phosphate groups, and when you break a phosphate group, it releases energy. That's energy stored in a chemical bond. And then that ADP is always recharged in the cell. A substrate B will allow for the addition of an additional 3rd phosphate onto this group of phosphate, and so we reconstitute, we recreate ATP. So that's all I wanted to say about energies and the cell and ATP. And we're going to really put that into the context of cellular respiration in an upcoming chapter. So just kind of get a feel for what it is that energy is, like how it's transformed from one form to another. It never disappears. It's just in one way or another. It's in one shape or another in the body, in the cells in the body. Okay, thank you for paying attention, and I'll see you in the next